our task can't be just to be deconstructing things. That's fine and necessary, but ultimately it's about what we say yes to, not just what we're saying no to. And so my attempt to read Mark was an attempt to actually be about reconstructing a faith that is profoundly personal and profoundly political.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to the Evangelical podcast where being labeled a heretic is a good thing, if it means refusing to conform to toxic, harmful expressions of faith. We address your questions about God, politics, how we got here, and how to move forward. Nothing is off limits in our conversations with scholars, spiritual seekers, and activists in our quest to uncover the heart of faith. We're your hosts, Melanie
and Gary Allen,
and this is Holy Heretics. Our guest today is author and activist theologian Ched Myers. He is a fifth-generation Californian, an author and a scholar who has worked in social change and radical discipleship for more than 40 years. He's authored over 100 articles and more than half a dozen books, including the paradigm-changing book called Binding the Strong Man, a political reading of Mark's story of Jesus. He holds a BA in philosophy from the University of California Berkeley and an MA in New Testament studies from the Graduate Theological Union. And he and his partner Elaine live in Southern California, where they work with the Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries. And their new book, Haunted Histories, a Settler Discipleship of Decolonization, tackles some of the oldest and deepest injustices in American history, which sounds fascinating. And also, it has alliteration, just like the name of this podcast. So welcome, Ched. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Melanie and Gary Allen, for having me.
Well, Ched, I'm especially excited to talk with you. I feel a little bit kind of like a fanboy. Your book, Binding the Strong Man, changed my life. And I know that that's a phrase that is used probably way too many times, but for me, in a crisis of faith about 10 years ago, I was introduced to your book, which crazily enough, you wrote, I think, in 1988, which I would love to know the backstory of that. But for me, it was the first time that I was introduced to this radical revolutionary Jesus who stood in solidarity with the oppressed, with the marginalized, and was just as concerned about what happens here and now, as opposed to, maybe a disembodied future. So I just want to start by saying thank you. You are probably the sole reason why I still call myself a Christian today. And I just want you to know that your book really impacted me in some really incredible ways. So thank you for that. So I'll finally ask my question now. So let's just kind of start there. In the book, Binding the Strong Man, you take a very deep dive into the fleshy Jesus, and you introduced the world to the notion of radical discipleship. Can you describe kind of what that means and what that looks like to be a radical disciple of Jesus in the modern world?
Well, thanks, Gary Allen. And both you and I were transformed by Mark's gospel. That's what does the transforming. The rest of us are just trying to figure out what it means in our lives and in our world. Radical discipleship, as we use it, I was the product of a movement in the English-speaking evangelical world of the 1970s, which called itself the Radical Discipleship Movement. And although not too many people march under that banner anymore, we persist in using it because for us it's not a dope slogan or a mobilizing soundbite or a hip brand or an ironic Twitter handle. Actually, both terms aren't even cool anymore. Radical is unfashionable today as it was trendy in the 60s, while the notion of discipleship is pretty much entirely shrugged off in liberal church circles and trivialized in conservative ones. So why do we insist on using the phrase? I guess because of the etymology of both terms. Radical, of course, comes from the Latin radix, or root. And that's the best reason, in my opinion, not to concede it to nostalgia. If we want to get to the root of anything, our vocation is to be radical. So no wonder that word was demonized by our masters and co-opted by marketing hucksters. And no wonder no one in conventional politics dares to use that word favorably in our day, much less track anything to its root. So, the notion of discipleship, on the other hand, it's kind of curious to me and revealing that discipleship is actually so marginal in our churches. It's curious because it is so unarguably the central theme of the Gospels. And it's revealing because it shows how wide the gulf between seminary, sanctuary, and streets has become in North America. So, as I've tried to survey the terrain of churches in our society, it seems like the prevailing expressions of faith, at least among Protestants, is either decisionism, which of course is primary among evangelicals, denominationalism, which tends to characterize the mainstream, or dogmatism, which can sometimes be the mark of fundamentalism, but also sometimes people of all stripes. Decisionism, denominationalism, dogmatism are each problematic in our society, which is mired in dysfunctional politics, delusional economics, and distractive culture. So as a kind of an alternative, it seems to me to make sense that discipleship is the road less traveled here at the heart of empire. I believe that we have truly yet to reckon with Bonhoeffer's famous warning delivered under the shadow of fascism that cheap grace is grace without discipleship. So one of my intellectual mentors is the great Swiss New Testament scholar Edward Schweitzer, who reiterated Bonhoeffer's dictum by asserting that from the perspective of Mark's gospel, Schweitzer was a Marx scholar, discipleship is the only form in which faith in Jesus can exist. It's a pretty broad and deep statement. And that challenge was subsequently advanced by one of Schweitzer's Australian students, Athol Gill, whose teaching of Mark as a manifesto of radical discipleship helped animate renewal movements in the 70s and 80s down under, and in the UK, people like John Vincent, and here in the States, our community was deeply influenced. So I'm a child of that theology and still trying to figure out what it is. Of course, it has a much deeper genealogy. This notion of radical discipleship as laying bare the roots of personal and political pathologies of our society and our dead-end history. So on the one hand, we're trying to get to the roots of what's wrong. On the other hand, we're trying to recover the roots of our deep biblical tradition, that movement of rebellion and restoration, of repentance and renewal, that way out of no way that has been going on since the dawn of resistance to the dusk of empire. So, that way has been animated from the beginnings of our deep biblical history, Abraham and Sarai and Moses and Miriam. It's reanimated through the prophets. Elijah read the riot act to Ahab, and Isaiah sang a love song, Lament to the Vineyard. And Ezekiel saw a wheel within the wheel, way up in the middle of the air. It was this tradition that animated John the Baptist to go feral, troubling Herod's business as usual, and then troubling Jordan's waters to rebirth a certain Nazarene, upon whom the old spirit of the movement came to rest like a condor. And Jesus, in turn, rebooted the old movement afresh, accompanied only by clueless fishermen and faithful women of ill repute. So this Jesus faces down the mammon system with loaves and fishes in the wilderness, remembers the old catechism of manna, redirects our attention away from temples and toward wildflowers and birds, raises up street beggars and brings down fat cats to co-inhabit a Jubilee common ground that his mama had sung to him about as a baby. And although the Nazarenes movement ground to a halt on the Roman cross, on which the imperial bill for discipleship came due, it was rebooted again in an empty tomb. And so they say that's how it all began. And it has continued throughout church history, from Pentecost to the monastic movement in the latter days of the Roman Empire. It was remembered by Franciscan nuns and friars, and 14th century communitarians who defied feudal canons of hierarchy, 16th century radical Anabaptists who refused to participate in the bloody religious wars of Christendom. It was invoked by Baptist radicals and Methodist reformers, Quaker abolitionists, Anglican visionaries, all working against the grain of colonial plunder and genocide. It was the ground on which 18th century levelers stood in their struggle against the privatization of the commons. Since this is Jubilee, sets all at liberty, let us be glad. It's how the Luddites resisted factory culture in early industrial England, immigrant wobbly and Jewish labor organizers a century later in Gilded Age America, and above all, this tradition of faith was preserved for us by African slaves under American apartheid, who knew who Pharaoh was and where the promised land was, and who journeyed there on an underground railroad singing, "Go down, Moses." And I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? And nobody knows the trouble I see. So these are all Jubilee anthems, aren't they? And they came alive again in 20th century civil rights movement that reached from Selma to Soweto. It's a freedom song that was birthed in a Jim Crow jail and blew across the world to cross-pollinate to the Berlin Wall and Tiananmen Square and the streets of Manila. So that's the vision of radical discipleship. Sorry, there's no soundbite answer because it's a tradition. It's what Ruby Sales calls a great river that's been going on and on through the centuries, and we have to dip down into it to be part of that stream that works against the stream of imperial culture. And that to me is worth giving my life to. And it's the best party in town, as we like to say, however small and funky and marginal it may be. And that's church to me. And I think that's been the best of church from the beginning of our tradition.
So you're saying that this is like a tradition that has followed all of Christian history. So then how did we get to this point where we have voices like John MacArthur or the Gospel Coalition, or I don't even know how many thousands of pastors signed that 2018 statement on social justice and the gospel? How do we get to that point where instead of resisting the colonialism and the empire, it seems like they're colluding with it, and how do we lose that tradition if that is our tradition? Like what happened there?
Well, we haven't lost that tradition. That tradition of radical discipleship has always existed in a church that has also always been compromised, at least since the 3rd century. So, authoritarian evangelicalism is just the newest iteration of an old dysfunction in our faith tradition, which is to equate the conserving of the world as it is with the vision of God's kingdom. And so I don't dialogue with people such as those in the Gospel Coalition. Um, so I can't really speak for a lot of these folks, but I do know that there's always been a sort of a desire to um, a suspicion of change, a suspicion of difference.
Hmm.
Who was it who were most opposed to Jesus of Nazareth? It was the religious leadership. Um, it only took a couple of centuries for um, Christianity to cut a deal with the Roman Empire under Constantine. And so we are not uh, strangers to a kind of version of the faith that rides shotgun with systems of power and domination, and indeed often become apologists for that. And that there's a very strong streak of that in U.S. history from the very outset. Um, but it's not unique to the American story, and it's just has certain rather aggravating iterations in our history. And so this conversation between what we might call discipleship versus um, dogmatism, that would be the tendency of the Gospel Coalition, I think. Um, on one hand, but on the other hand, the kind of decisionist faith of many evangelicals who really think that the only important transaction of faith is to get saved, and everything else after that is kind of secondary. It's a bit like a vaccination, I guess, huh? Um,
Right. Well, and
and
I want to. Can
yeah,
I
go ahead.
jump in on that? Can I jump in
Sure.
on that? Because that's the faith that I think most of us were raised in, that Jesus came to save you from your sins, and then you made that decision, and then you sort of lived the rest of your life as a good conservative Republican American. Um, and the notion of the gospel had very little to do with what actually happened here and now.
Yeah.
Um, and when I read Binding the Strong Man, it was really, as I said earlier, the first time when I realized that salvation, if it is going to happen anywhere, it happens here, and it's embodied, and it is about liberation. And in particular, there was this notion there that really changed my view of Christianity, which was all about Jesus as a nonviolent resistor, that he resisted the powers that be, and he gave his life, and he changed the world through nonviolence. But that notion of nonviolence and pacifism, especially in the American church, the white American church, it really is anathema to many of us. Can you speak about the nonviolent resisting Jesus? I know you've talked about it a little bit already, but this notion that the God of the universe was enfleshed in this historical Jesus who was nonviolent. And that was a central mark of discipleship, if I'm remembering that from your book.
Yeah, I certainly want to talk about Jesus, but it's always important for us to understand the context into which we attempt to um, speak and embrace the gospel. And the caricature that you drew of the business of getting saved actually is a very American phenomenon. That
Mm.
is something that's highly characteristic of evangelicalism, but it hasn't always been fused with Republican politics. That your podcast is about the deconstruction of about deconstruction for ex-evangelicals, um, and the last 15 years in our work, we've been working with a lot of the folks who have found us and who are kind of fleeing from this evangelical world and looking for more holistic, integral faith. And there's been a lot of damage, as you all see. I think that's what's animating your podcast.
Mm.
Damage around God, around sex, around authoritarian notions of leadership. But above all, around church as shaped by the culture of capitalism.
Mm.
And so we need to understand how we got to this point. I think evangelicals began to lose their social mission after the fundamentalist split in the early 20th century, in which people turned further inward into a kind of me and Jesus to really, to escape the corrosive social alienation that comes with industrialization. This turn, however, coincided with the rise of commercial capitalism and the explosion of the advertising industry in the first two decades of the 20th century. So slowly but surely over the last 8 decades, with, I should add, a lot of big dollar encouragement from the business community, most evangelicals bought into the notion that the gospel is a product, that evangelism is advertising, that churches are enterprises, that church members are customers or worse, products, and that church leaders are chief operating executives. So it's hardly surprising that the old denominational structures, as they give way, have been replaced by a kind of entrepreneurial, autonomous ministries, big box megachurches whose campuses feel like malls. Rather than non-conforming to the dominant culture, as per Paul's instructions in Romans 12:1, many churches are just reproducing market-shaped habits and consciousness, whether it's race and class segregation in schools as well as churches, or suburban aesthetics, or worship as entertainment, or leadership as celebrity. So during this time, so that's the period now you're talking about, the last 50 years, during which period non-denominational evangelicalism replaced mainstream Protestantism as the official civil religion of the U.S., thanks in large part to the strategic rise of the religious right in the aftermath of the 1960s. So many adults today were formed and deformed in these spaces throughout the Reagan-Bush era. I think that's a large part of the folks that you're talking to. The good news is, in my opinion, that despite a resurgence of the worst of white supremacist Christian nationalism under Trump, the glacial ice of imperial evangelicalism is beginning to break up. We see it everywhere because we're getting the refugees. Now, unfortunately, this most apt analogy is the fragmenting of the polar ice caps, which is an awful result of climate catastrophe. But that's what's happening religiously. The ice of authoritarian evangelicalism is breaking up, and all sorts of new little pathways are opening up. For the last 10 years, we've seen so many streamlets of ex-evangelical life opening up, like the Sophia Society. Now, of course, a lot of people are drowning too, and many are chucking the faith altogether, but that's fertile ground for revisiting the tradition of radical discipleship. When we talk about the gospel, about the politics of Jesus, the religious right for the last 50 years started out saying it wasn't political because the old pietism wasn't political. It was more privatistic. The religious right kept saying, no, we're not being political. It's all those people on the left who are political, and ended up curating a thoroughly reactionary politics that was unaccountable. Now we have a politically polarized situation where civil discourse is impossible. So we see the task before us as people who want to remain in the faith to re-enfranchise the proper vocation of politics by insisting on its most generic definition, that politics is nothing more and nothing less than about how power is distributed in a community. So everything is political, right? Not voting is political. How we consume is political. How we engage in relationships, how we move our bodies around transportation-wise. It's all political, even spirituality, right? Disassociating from the language of historic Christianity is a political move. Appropriating native rituals is a political move. That once we understand that everything is political, now we can go back and read the Jesus story and understand that everything Jesus is about is about how power is being distributed and shared or not shared, concentrating, being abused. And you realize that he is taking place, his story is taking place in a real landscape in which there are real rich and poor, there are real militias, there are people dying from grinding poverty, there are folks struggling to survive as dry farming peasants on the margins, and he's trying to say, so what's the good news here for people? What is God's compassionate love and justice like in this moment? So I think it's a really great time to not abandon the gospel, but to double down on the gospel. But that just is really hard for people who have only ever received this one-dimensional, highly hijacked version of the gospel.
So I'm curious, because the book is about, your first book, not the most recent one, but your Binding the Strong Man is about Mark. And so what is it about Mark's version of the story of Jesus that shows us Jesus as that radical revolutionary, or as that person who's resisting empire and colonization and, speaking up for the marginalized and the oppressed?
Yeah, sure. I would be the last person to try to make a case that Mark is over and against the other gospels. It's Mark is somehow uniquely has a radical view of Jesus. I think the entire New Testament is a witness to the radical Jesus. It just happens that Mark is the first of our gospels. We know this, and not canonically, but historically, it's the first story to be committed to papyrus. And so Mark has been tended to be the testing grounds in New Testament studies for new ways or old ways of reading Scripture, of testing out methodologies. So I wanted to test out a methodology of reading the Gospel as a kind of a socio-literary narrative that was expressing a community's struggle to survive amidst an extremely cruel slave-based Roman Empire. In other words, simply to bring the gospel back to earth. In that sense, the old adage that parables are earthly stories with heavenly meanings. Of course, that's exactly what parables are not. Parables are earthly stories with heavy meanings, as my teacher Bill Doug used to say. But really, the whole gospel is like that. It's very much a story about human beings struggling for life and struggling for a modicum of freedom and relationality and sustenance amidst disparity, violence, and alienation. Well, we're still in that story as human beings. And so Mark's gospel as kind of the first take on that life of this recontextualizing prophet is a huge resource to all of us who want to reconstruct faith. Right? Our task can't be just to be deconstructing things. That's fine and necessary, but ultimately it's about what we say yes to, not just what we're saying no to. And so my attempt to read Mark was an attempt to actually be about reconstructing a faith that is profoundly personal and profoundly political. And Mark, of course, is in some ways the sparest, the most immediate of our gospels, the shortest, which helps when you're trying to do popular pedagogy. Because if folks don't have the attention span to get through more than a soundbite, they're going to have a hard time struggling with longer gospels. So Mark's a great place to begin. InterVarsity student Christian movement understood that, and it was all about tutoring and encouraging college students to read Mark Twain. And that was my first exposure. I wasn't raised in the church. So as a young adult, here I was encountering the gospel, but without the kind of heavy dogmatic tutorial and frame that it so often comes with. And on the other hand, I had the great privilege of being mentored by some of the finest radical Christian folk in the history of the second half of the 20th century. And so it was that way that I felt personally moved by in my own life, and hence committed to propagating, I suppose, this amazing story of Jesus, who, unlike our churches or our economy, didn't promise freedom and deliver captivity, but rather challenged captivity in the vision of freedom. So Mark is great.
How has that played out in particular in your life? You just mentioned a little bit of that. Do you call yourself a social activist? And if so, what does radical discipleship look like in your life personally today?
Well, I've been called worse than social activist. That's for sure. Well, let me make clear, first of all, that I call myself a Christian. There's a lot of particularly post-evangelicals who want to dissociate from all language, the historic tradition. They want to be free-floating signifiers. They don't want to be, labeled. And then they immediately set about thinking of cool brands and labels that they can march under. I don't find that useful. I found that very postmodern in the capitalist sense, trying to commodify our experience. I do identify myself as a Christian for two reasons. One is I'm really trying to work out what that means through practice and theology. But secondly, to identify with Christianity is to say, yep, and that means we got to answer for all the crap, and that's considerable, that has gone under that name for 2,000 years. Not to do that, to imagine we can disavow that somehow and start fresh is disingenuous. It's the opposite of accountability. And I think our challenge is to figure out how to atone for and repair the damage that's been done in the name of Christianity, while trying to reconstruct a more humane and equity-based and life-giving faith. And first part of that task is exhuming those parts of our tradition that have always inhabited the margins of the institutional church, which is like an ecosystem, right? The ecotone, the edge pieces are always where the greatest biodiversity is, and that's true in the church too. So when I call myself a radical Christian, that is someone who inhabits the margins of institutions with other folks who are working the margins of their traditions. So my wife and I are Mennonites. We're members of the Mennonite Church, and we value that tradition and apprentice to that tradition. But we're not unaware of the contradictions and problems of that tradition historically, like all the other traditions. In terms of my own discipleship, I've tried to work as a popular educator and an engaged social justice activist, really since I came to the faith in the mid 70s, and that has had a variety of iterations as I've kept trying to open myself up to the terrain of the pain in our world. So I worked for many years around issues of militarism as a kind of a primary hammer of an imperial culture. I worked for many years flowing out of that with indigenous people internationally who were on the business end of that hammer. I then felt like after 10 years of doing that, I needed to come and work domestically and figure out how that worked in our society. So I worked in Los Angeles as a community organizer around issues of fair housing, racial justice, education, equity. I lived through the Los Angeles uprising of 1991, 1992, first Gulf War of 1991. And those were real focalizers for me in trying to understand what's happening in this culture. And it wasn't until the late 1990s that I felt like I wanted to work even-handedly as an activist and a theological educator. So I published Binding the Strongman in 1988, but I was not working in the academy. I didn't want to work in the academy, didn't feel called to that. I also didn't feel called to the ordained ministry. So for me, the question was, what is the intersection between seminary, sanctuary, streets, and soil? How do we draw from the best of those aspects and shape our witness and practice accordingly? And so that's why we started Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries in the late 90s as a way of curating both theological education and social movement participation. So we continue to work on everything from immigrant rights to sustainable agriculture. We live and work in an ecological demonstration project here in the Ojai Valley on Chumash territory. We're deeply involved in indigenous sovereignty struggles. And Sabbath economics has been a major strand of our work over the last 20 years, talking about the dysfunction of market capitalism, indeed how that actually is a heresy, and trying to exhume the radical.
Did you just say that?
Yes, I know. It's your marching brand. It's awesome.
But you questioned capitalism. How dare you?
Well, see, that's exactly what heretics do, and why they're branded as such. Is they question the conventional wisdom. That's what the prophetic tradition has always done, right back to the beginning. So economic critique and engagement is a very big part of our work. So over the years, there are very few issues, social issues, that we haven't been involved with directly or indirectly, because one needs to kind of see the whole terrain. But ultimately, our interest is nurturing disciples to work at that intersection of seminary, sanctuary, street, and soil, to always try to hold all that together and to be Christian in that way in our society. And that's some heavy lifting, as you know.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like your new book flows directly out of that. I mean, Healing Haunting Histories, a Settler Discipleship of Decolonization. It sounds like it intersects with a lot of those areas that you've worked. So tell us a little bit about that book and why you decided to write that.
Well, thanks. That project really arises from my wife's story primarily, or at least that's how we decided to focus on it. She is the grandchild of refugees coming from Ukraine as Mennonites who were beat up pretty badly during the Russian Civil War, deeply traumatized, and escaped and settled in the Canadian prairies. wonderful community of people with deep faith, deep Anabaptist faith. But here they were, they settled right next to Cree indigenous communities on the prairies that have been even more disenfranchised and displaced, including by Mennonites coming to settle. And so here was this tragic irony of two traumatized communities living side by side and really not knowing each other. And Mennonites, over several generations, assuming white privileges and entitlements in a way that Cree folk never could. And so the question that the book asks is, how do those of us who are the descendants of European settlers in North America make sense of this history of violation which inhabits every part of both settler and indigenous worlds, past and present. These wounds, or what we call hauntings, are inextricably woven into the fabric of our personal and political lives as settlers. But we also believe that we are called by the gospel to not only confront, but to heal those hauntings. So the book tries to explore the places, peoples, and spirits that have formed and deformed us, looking at issues of Indigenous justice and our responsibility as settlers for justice, primarily through the lens of Elaine's family narrative, but arguing that every settler needs to look at his or her own family and communal history to see how we carry our forebears' immigrant travails and trauma, how we perpetuate our settler unknowing and agnosia, refusal to know what happened in the past, our complicity with these structures of displacement, but also what traditions of resilience and conscience that our ancestors drew on and that we draw on today. So it's been a really long project. It's part memoir, part social, historical, and theological analysis, and part personal, practical workbook, trying to invite settler Christians into what we call discipleship of decolonization, which is about undoing the incredibly deeply embedded harms that have resulted from hundreds of years of colonization and displacement of the first peoples of this continent. And so we're excited. It just came out last month, and we're already up to our ears doing workshops and talking with people about it. It's kind of the first layer when it comes to North America. It's the first layer of of responsibility for us, and particularly for people for whom the colonial regime has privileged, which would be most of us, right? White middle class folk, whose ignorance and entitlements and privileges rest upon these deep histories, whether that's in Colorado or New Mexico or California. We understand that landscapes are haunted by the violence of the past. Just look at the struggle, the historiographic struggle over the Sand Creek Massacre, not too far from Colorado Springs, Gary Allen, and the struggle over how one tells that history and what it means.
And how we cover it up or we don't tell it, and in particular that massacre, which seems to be one of the most brutal and inhumane massacres in American history. And I think we like to tell each other lies. We especially about our past, which means a lot about who we are today. And yeah, it's interesting. One of the things we try to do with our kids is, in particular, to help them with decolonization, is to study and show them whose land do we actually live on. And let's look at that history and the word you said, displacement, and realize that, this is not virgin land. This is mostly widowed land that we inhabit. And sadly, of course, so much of that history has been wrapped in the flag and, the notion of imperialism. So I think the work that you're doing, and I can't wait to read that book. so thank you for that.
Yeah, if I may say, if folks want to find the book, they can go to www.healinghauntedhistories.org, healinghauntedhistories.org, and there you'll find the book and some reviews of it, and you can find a discount code to order it. So yeah, we
Nice.
really are offering this as a practical workbook for settler Christians in North America. It's a binational book. We're talking equally about the U.S. and Canada. I really want to encourage people to wrestle with these issues, and it's a time, right? The Black Lives Matter movement, Standing Rock. This is a time in which people are again breaking the silence, and so it's yet another opportunity for white folks to overcome this mendacious culture that we've built around ourselves and come to terms with who we really are, and that's good news for the gospel. That's about repentance, turning our history around.
Yeah. And we'll make sure to link to that in the show notes as well, so
Yeah,
people can
thanks.
find it there. But since we are running out of time, even though I feel like we could talk about so much more, I want to ask you the question that we like to ask everyone, because, you know, it's so easy to see what's broken. It's so easy to see what's wrong in the world today, or what's wrong with the church, or what's wrong with the Christian legacy. And it's harder to find those rays of hope. So for you, Ched, what gives you hope for the future of faith and for the future of Christianity, and for those who are calling themselves evangelicals and leaving the church? What gives you hope for them as they plow forward?
I think we have to become comfortable with uh, seeing hope on the margins and not expecting for not keeping our eyes trained on the center or on the mainstream, because that's where hope, change have always, always, always come from poor people's movements, from disenfranchised communities breaking their silence. That's certainly true around the world, but it's especially true here in North America. So what gives me hope is people like you who represent the breaking up of the ice pack of authoritarian evangelicalism, and now are swimming in streams and trying to figure out, okay, now what do we do? Who are we? How do we follow Jesus in this time? Um, it's a very confusing time because there's so many, the ice is breaking up in so many ways, and there's water is running every which way, and it's a dangerous time because you can get hit on the head by a piece of falling ice. But there's some really interesting kinds of explorations and reconstructions, folks reconnecting with the history of radical Christianity, which is a magnificent history, especially in the United States. There's been so many Christian dissidents and Christian heroes of protest and of alternative expressions of justice. Um, learning those histories, I think, is a basic catechism for ex-evangelicals that want to um, forge a reconstructed identity. The evangelical church always loves the fiction that it's the true church, but in fact, the church has always been multivocal, and especially for people's expressions of faith, particularly the Black church. It's a magnificent history of resilience and struggle and survivance, as Indigenous people say. So it's the fact that things are slowly opening up in all sorts of different ways, both within and outside of the church. I take to be a sign of hope. Reina Ortega is one of our colleagues we work with locally. She was born in Mexico, terribly abusive childhood, pursued by gangs, came up, a documented person, worked in the industrial celery fields of the Oxnard Plain in our county, and discovered the Abundant Table Farm Project as a local expression of sustainable, organic, egalitarian agriculture. And Reina and then her husband both came to manage this farm as refugees from industrial agriculture, and to watch them flourish. And now they're the managers of this farm, and they're doing amazing. Guadalupe is this incredible agriculturalist with these deep indigenous competences, and he's making this beautiful farm on a shoestring, surrounded by a faith community that's working with them to shape this collective. That doesn't follow any script. That doesn't come out of any mainstream seminary or evangelistic program design. But this is what happens when people experiment with their own discipleship in ways that in the local areas they are. And I think it's expressive of the kind of creative rebuilding that's happening all around the country. One of our young African American colleagues is doing a PhD in scatology to try to figure out how to wean our culture off of one of our biggest contradictions, which namely is we defecate in our fresh water, in our most precious source. And so how can we deal with our poop differently in a way that's more resilient? That would have sounded kind of insane even 10, 15 years ago, but this is what some of our young colleagues are doing, and they're doing it from their own faith discipleship. We've got friends in North Carolina who are working on a carnival of faith and resistance to tell the stories of the earth, of scripture, and of social justice. So it's right. It's the worst of times and the best of times, and I think if we focus on the dysfunction, that's kind of a way in which they win over our hearts and minds through the negative space that that they curate. And so I think reconstructive practices of prayer and contemplation, of community and worship, and of social witness and service, all of that gives me hope. And there's way more of that out there than makes the news or even makes the dominant social media. So our job, and it is a job, we have to be very intentional about it, is to build our literacy in dissident, subversive, and reconstructive movements of the past, and build our relationality with folks working on the ground now, whether that's the Poor People's Campaign that's working nationally, New Sanctuary Movement, the deep ecological movements that are being driven by people of faith. There's so much out there. A lot of our work is just helping folk connect with those movements. So it's my hope and prayer that your listenership will commit most of your energy to seeking out what is redemptive, which is happening all around us, and not take tie up too much of our time and energy feeling sorry for ourselves and the funky, dysfunctional institutions that we've endured so long, because that can just be a kind of privileged self mortification. And what
Well, and it's almost kind of a dead end too, right? Like it's just, I have the privilege to deconstruct this as opposed to actually rebuild it. So it's a very encouraging word and a convicting word, I think, for a lot of us. But I think you are onto something there, in particular with millennials and Gen Z who are already socially minded, and they've already realized that what they believe has to matter here and now. And I think there's incredible hope in that. So, all right, before we let you go, we do want to ask you just a couple of quick, like rapid fire questions. We do this with everyone.
Let's see if I can do it.
All right, here we go. All right, so Chad, first question: what's your favorite thing about living in California?
Yeah, I'm a fifth generation Californian, so it's deep in my bones. And I would say walking in the oak savanna, which is what Elaine and I did yesterday afternoon, um, where there are no invasive plants, and it's recovering from the terrible wildfire of 3 years ago in this bioregion, and it is flourishing. That is my favorite thing to do in California.
Mm,
And
sounds
surfing.
beautiful. Ooh, well, that sounds great too. Okay, so since you're an activist, is there a quick story of something that's just like crazy radical or revolutionary that you've done that other people would just be appalled at?
Well, I'm sure there's lots I've done that people would be appalled at. But one of my favorite stories that I've written about was when I was 21, I apprenticed myself to some radical Catholic resistors back in the ghettos of Baltimore. And Philip Berrigan, the great Irish Catholic priest, the first American priest to be arrested in protesting for war, was my mentor. And he took me into a dumpster. This long before dumpster diving was cool. And we were there we were picking through all this rotting vegetables, and so we could take it home and distribute it, the good stuff to the neighborhood. And I just, he suddenly turns to me and says, what is faith? And I just dumbfounded. And anyway, he said, what gives you hope? I didn't know. I was 21. And I was in a dumpster with freaking Amos the prophet. What did I know? And he just whirls at me and he says, I'll tell you what hope is. Hope is where your ass is. Like if you're going to be in jail, if you're going to be among marginalized people, if you're going to be in the mix on the streets, where you put your ass is, no matter what you say, that is where your hope is. And that's a great lesson for me that maybe some people would be appalled at.
I love that. What's the best thing that has happened to you so far this year?
So far this year,
besides this podcast interview,
we took our own annual institute online last month, and I was very nervous about that. But we had over 200 people wrestling with the issues that we write about in Healing Haunted Histories, and particularly keying on communities of color and how they work in solidarity with Indigenous folk. And we had Starsky Wilson, amazing new executive director of Children's Defense Fund. And we had Stephen Charleston, amazing Choctaw elder and Episcopal bishop. And we had some Allison McCrary, an Indigenous lawyer from New Orleans, working in social movements. And that was just really cool to realize that there's a lot of hunger for being in a circle where we can actually talk about what matters and not have to kind of fend off the nonsense. So that was the best thing that's happened.
Okay, since none of us can do this right now, what's the best vacation you've ever taken?
Not my strong suit, uh, as my partner will attest. Um, we've had a number of really great opportunities in conjunction with travel for our work. That we've seen some amazing landscapes and amazing communities. I think of New Zealand, Aotearoa, and working with Maori communities there and radical
Mm.
discipleship circles there. Was really fantastic.
Hmm.
And my favorite vacation spot is just a little sleepy seaside town just 2 hours north of us, where we go to sit, stare at the water, and that's great too.
Mm.
Well, Ched, this has been really fantastic, incredibly enlightening, convicting for anyone who wants more information about the Bartimaeus Cooperative or your new book. Where can we point them?
You can find Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries at bcm-net.org. You can find a lot of our publications at shedmyers.org. And as noted, you can find the new book at healinghauntedhistories.org. We're not in the Twitter sphere or the Instagram gram because we're just not that cool. But we do have some websites where you can find us. And I just want to again commend you all for what you're doing. It's right at the heart of what needs to happen right now as things break apart. New seeds are being planted and new plants are being nourished, and you're part of that. So I commend you um, for doing that and having a very nice aesthetic in your online presence. And thanks for the hospitality that you've shown to me today. And as I blather on,
This is great. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. And like I said earlier, we will make sure to link to all of that in the show notes so people can find that in one place. And seriously, this has been really great. And we have just appreciated hearing your perspective and from your immense experience. And I think a lot of people will be encouraged by it. So thank you for this, Ched.
Thanks, Ched.
we'll keep up the good work, friends, and hope our paths cross soon.
This episode was written by Gary Allen Taylor and Melanie Mudge and produced by the Sophia Society. Music is by Faith in Foxholes, and sound levels were mixed by Joshua Mudge.